Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us at the OpenSciEd Research Agenda Kickoff. I'm Kevin McElhaney, Senior Research Scientist at Digital Promise. Before I introduce our first speaker, I just want to mention that everyone is welcome to type questions into the chat, and we'll collect all the questions and address them in our follow-up communications so we don't distract from the presentations. And to kick us off, I'd like to introduce Jean-Claude Broussard, our CEO of Digital Promise. And he'll speak from his experience as a science teacher, district leader, and advocate for educational equity.
Kevin, thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I taught high school chemistry and physics in New York City for a number of years. One of my greatest frustrations was having my students walk into my courses, having little conceptual understanding of the science they were engaging. I had to work really hard to disabuse them of wanting to just plug in numbers into a formula and getting an answer that they frankly did not really understand. I am too old of a teacher to have had NGSS when I was teaching high school chemistry and physics, but I learned quickly as a teacher that if I had an interesting concept, an interesting demonstration or phenomenon, I would hold out my students' interest and attention. So I took to doing what my students call science tricks to introduce concepts like property changes in metals, combustion, insulation, etc. As a teacher, with the help of a supportive assistant principal, we figured some things out. As a district leader, I knew I had to create structure so my teachers did not have to figure things out. So I fundamentally begin to work on the kinds of curricular structure to provide access to great curriculum, great pedagogical practices, and of course, the kinds of supports teachers need to make that happen in our schools. So we work hard to bring those to the hands of our teachers. Assuring consistency across the district, again, in terms of access, in terms of rigor, was the way in which we push for equity. So I'm grateful for the OpenSciEd work and very grateful for Carnegie's support and leadership in this space. So without taking much more time, I'm happy to introduce Jim Short, Program Director, Leadership and Teaching to Advanced Learning at Carnegie Corporation.
Thanks, Jean-Claude, for kicking us off this morning, and welcome to Digital Promise in the new role in the organization. We look forward to continuing our collaboration. And thanks for the introduction. I'm real excited to be here today. I'm real excited to see this work kick off. And as a former science teacher myself, like Jean-Claude, really think this work is at a great moment in our history of science ed to engage a group of researchers and hope that folks get excited today about what's shared and what the possibilities are. I've been involved in science education for over 30 years, and what I'm going to share today is sort of where we are at the Carnegie Corporation in terms of our science strategy and how this work fits into it, trying to set a context for this. So we can go to the next slide. Part of our theory of change about how this work happens in the field is taken from some work that Roger Bybee did many years ago in Achieving Scientific Literacy, and that is talking about the 4 Ps of curriculum reform. And I'm going to use that today to frame kind of where we've been and where we're going and what still needs to take place in terms of how we're investing in science education. So the first stage here is about the purposes of science education, and that's like creating a vision. And the framework for K-12 science education helped do that, which I'm sure everybody on this call is familiar with. And that led to then Achieve working with 26 states to develop the standards, the next generation science standards based on the framework for K-12 science education. And those served as policies that could then be adopted to guide science education. And as it sort of indicates here on the timeline, that work took place in a relatively short period of time, but started almost a decade ago. So we consider that being very successful. But as we move into the latter stages of shifting programs and changing teacher practices, there's still much work to get done. We are seeing an emerging high quality examples of new instructional programs, new instructional materials and curricula that are designed for the next generation science standards. And districts are starting to notice those, as we'll see, and we share the impact of OpenSciEd. And that takes a little longer, and then it takes even longer to change teachers' practices at scale. And we think that a lot of that's going to happen when we go a little deeper into thinking about what curriculum-based professional learning looks like. And so if we go to the next slide, just to remind folks about the investments that Carnegie Corporation has made, the Board on Science Education at the National Academies has been a strong partner for us for many, many years. And the science strategy that I'm sharing sort of started over a decade ago with a report that the corporation developed, that the Institute for Advanced Study helped create, called the Opportunity Equation. And in that report, it talked about the need in this country for new standards in math and science, new ways of preparing teachers, new types of curriculum and school designs to support that. And as the Common Core effort took off shortly thereafter for addressing the math, the corporation turned to science. And what many folks don't know is that the Carnegie Corporation was the primary funder, sole funder behind supporting the National Academies, the Board on Science Education to develop the framework, as well as supporting Achieve to work with the writers in 26 states to develop the next NGSS, and continue to support Achieve through a few years of adoption, helping states adopt new standards. In addition to that work, the corporation's also invested in several consensus studies and reports that the Academy has put out. Most recently, the one on guidance for teaching during the pandemic this past year, which came out last year, as well as two consensus studies, one that was completed in 2019 on the K-6-12 science and engineering practices, and a current study around the pre-K to 5 practices. So this has all laid the foundation, I think, for the purposes and the policies. If we move to the next slide, this begins to look at our strategy in terms of a theory of action. Like, how do we move from purposes and policies to programs and practices? And that requires kind of moving deeper into implementation. And so there are 5 different kind of areas that we have invested in with a group of grantees. Today, we're going to learn a lot more about the OpenSciEd initiative, which focuses a lot on developing K-12 instructional materials designed for the NGSS. And at this point has almost accomplished that completely in middle school, in the final phases of field testing the last units and revising them. And now beginning to move into high school with elementary later this year on the horizon. But we've also invested in some interim assessments that the Lawrence Hall has been developing that'll be released later this year for each of the middle school performance expectations that could serve as interim assessments as a district is implementing a new middle school program designed for the NGSS. We've also made some grants in leadership development. Both of these were last year. They've been delayed a little bit because of the pandemic, but will be kicking off later this summer and fall. And that's the Council of State Science Supervisors hosting an OpenSciEd 50 conference planned for October to have the 10 states involved in OpenSciEd be able to share with teams from all 50 states about the curriculum, as well as a leadership academy called the Nexus Academy that WestEd and BSCS launched last year that involves 4 OpenSciEd states working with districts to go deeper into the implementation and support to develop the curriculum. So all of these efforts have involved consortiums of curriculum developers, learning scientists, some researchers, as well as state and district partners. So what we want to do today is sort of focus on this research agenda piece, and Digital Promise was more than happy to help us put this convening together and to start the effort to create a research agenda to study the implementation of OpenSciEd, which means studying the implementation of what the NGSS and the framework look like in action. So I'm going to use the remainder of my time just to give you a little more of an overview of what OpenSciEd is. So we can move to the next slide. 4 years ago, the corporation put out a report about the status of where we are with implementation of NGSS, and themes around supply and demand were very prominent. And so shortly thereafter, we initiated or launched OpenSciEd, and 4 other national foundations have joined us in the support of this, developing a middle school program, full course materials. The goal here is to create high quality, freely available science instructional material. So even though there are costs involved in implementation, teachers should have access to classroom instructional materials as well as professional learning materials that are all freely available to download. And we'll see that that has definitely begun to happen. So who is OpenSciEd? If we go to the next slide, we're going to look at kind of OpenSciEd by the numbers. And so OpenSciEd involves 3 staff members. Jim Ryan and Sarah Delaney came to OpenSciEd from working in San Francisco public schools, San Francisco Unified, in STEM and science education. And then earlier last year, Matt Crable joined the team. Many of you know Matt from his work with Achieve. And so that's the group. But obviously all the work that OpenSciEd's doing is not coming just from 3 people. So if we go to the next slide, one of the ways that OpenSciEd works is it brings together a consortium of folks to do the curriculum development. And so these are the organizations involved in the curriculum development, in the professional learning design, in developing facilitators in all 10 states that are involved in OpenSciEd, as well as collecting the field test data, as well as other implementation data, which some of which Danny Edelson's going to share later in this presentation. So the middle school involved 5 organizations. Most of these are also involved in now beginning to work around the high school work. If we go to the next slide, we'll see a map, and there's several layers to this. One is we see that 20 states adopted NGSS, 24 more states have adopted new science standards that were influenced by the framework in NGSS. And so going back to those ideas about purposes and policies, we've had a lot of impact in this country with states adopting new science standards. And if they weren't NGSS, they were standards aligned with the vision of NGSS. And so that's been very successful. The 10 states labeled here with OpenSciEd are the partner states that have been at the table every month working on this initiative for now almost 3 years. And their commitment continues to grow as we are moving from middle school to high school. So what does it look like in these 10 states? If we go to the next slide, there are 65 facilitators that 2 times a year have been coming together to learn how to teach with the new units, the field test units, and then working with teachers to support them, so that in addition to supporting field test teachers, states are also building capacity for folks in their state to know how to do the launch professional learning to help teachers with these new materials. And at the end of this, I'm going to just mention something about curriculum-based professional learning. OpenSciEd has a very unique approach to, I think, how they design and facilitate their professional learning, and it's part of what I call the secret sauce of how OpenSciEd works, and something for researchers to pay attention to. If we go to the next slide, over 200 teachers have been involved in the field testing of OpenSciEd units. This is many more teachers than are needed in order to field test and get feedback to improve materials. But we needed to build demand for these materials as well. And so that was one of the reasons the initiative welcomed 10 states when they had interest, and continued to recruit teachers from over 100 school districts across these 10 states. We go to the next slide. There's been almost 6,000 teachers or students that have been part of the data collection effort during the field testing. There are probably 4, almost 5 times this number that have actually been involved in learning with OpenSciEd materials. So because many of those teachers teach multiple sections of middle school science, but only one of their classes is involved in the field test data. And like I said, later in this presentation, Danny Edelson from BSCS is going to share what we're learning from those field test results. If we go to the next slide, these are the 18 units that make up the courses, the 6th, 7th, and 8th grade science courses of what OpenSciEd has been able to accomplish. They got these 10 states to agree to a common scope and sequence so that coherence could be built into the curriculum and connections be made within units and across grades. So this is something that really is new and innovative for what NGSS is doing, in addition to other things like incorporating engineering into the design of the curriculum and connecting it to Common Core math and language arts and so forth, as well as the phenomenon based in the 3-dimensionality. Some of these units have been finalized and the final versions have been publicly released. Some of these, the field test version is what's released, and the final version will come out later this year. If we go to the next slide, because of everything that districts have been struggling with over the past year, OpenSciEd used this as an opportunity to work with 2 states and their teachers to develop remote versions or adaptations of OpenSciEd units. OpenSciEd units are not only freely available, but they're available in Creative Commons licensing, which means they're creating derivatives of the curriculum is almost encouraged or definitely more accessible. And so they didn't change the unit per se, but they gave lots of guidance for how to teach the unit during remote settings, whether you were doing it in person or asynchronous, or whether you were in a hybrid situation or completely remote. And so this was another way to sort of be able to leverage emerging digital content and meet the needs of teachers. If we go to the next slide, OpenSciEd, in addition to its middle school full course curriculum, has also developed a set of COVID-19 health and equity science units that were funded outside those national funders by a private foundation. And these are not necessarily designed for the NGSS, but were designed to provide teachers with something to help students learn something about health and equity during the pandemic, because it was obviously part of everybody's experience. And so this is another way to sort of engage people. And some folks may come to OpenSciEd interested in these units and then like the way the instructional model works, and then want to look at maybe other units related to their core science program. And then if we go to the next slide, just to look at the numbers, over 20,000 educators have been to the OpenSciEd website and registered, which they need to do in order to access the materials. And so there's clearly a growing interest in these materials. Just as a bookmark, there's about 70,000 middle school teachers in the country. And so, but that's what most of these numbers represent are middle school science teachers, obviously, because that's who'd be the most interested. So there's definitely interest, lots of downloads, and the videos that go with the curriculum are not the kind of YouTube video that probably people sit around and watch on their own on the weekends with their family. These are instructional videos tied to the activities themselves. And so you can see from these numbers that this is way beyond just the use of the field test teachers, but other folks looking at these videos and hopefully even using them in the classroom. And then I'd like to wrap up by just sharing, if you go to the next slide, a report that we put out last year that I co-authored with Stephanie Hirsch, former executive director of Learning Forward, thinking about what the elements of curriculum-based professional learning look like. And again, the goal here was to create some common language for professional learning providers, curriculum developers, schools and districts, leaders, to think about what are the different components of what make really effective curriculum-based professional learning. We know a lot about effective professional learning, but when it's focused around the use of new curriculum and involves learning how to use new instructional materials, what things need to be paid attention to. And so again, I put this in front of this audience because I think this is another framework or lens that one could look at from a research perspective about how districts are providing professional learning to support teachers. So again, I want to thank you for coming today. Look forward to hearing the questions that folks have, and hope that there's a research community that wants to come together and help us think about a research agenda for OpenSciEd and start thinking about studies that could take place. Because now we have teachers and students around the country using the same materials, which create a more consistent, non-variable component of doing research, because lots of people are working with the same core instructional materials. So I just think it's a great opportunity. And just like we brought a consortium of curriculum developers and learning scientists together, we'd love to bring a group of researchers together to help us think about how to study this to make the implementation even stronger. So I'm going to hand it over to Jeremy Rochelle to kick us off to move into the rest of the program.
Hi, I'm Jeremy Rochelle. I'm the Executive Director of our Learning Sciences Research Group here at Digital Promise. And Jim, that was just terrific to see the whole breadth of the timeline over which support for greater, better science materials has been growing, and also to see where we are now. 21,000 registered users, activity concentrated in 10 states already, 6,000 students involved in field tests, and growing. And so this is really a great time to start accelerating how people can become involved in research. That's what I'm going to talk about briefly now. Next slide, please. So we at Digital Promise, working with OpenSciEd, envision multiple kinds of research. And so I wanted to clarify 3 here. It may be that you have a very general science education research question that you want to look at. And OpenSciEd is a set of curricular materials and professional development experiences that can help you study that question you have. It could be that you're looking at OpenSciEd and you're going to hear shortly about some very specific distinctive innovations that are baked into it. For example, the storyline approach, and then it builds on student questioning. And maybe you want to push your research deeper into those facets that OpenSciEd now really enables. And the third kind of research is maybe you want to partner with OpenSciEd to improve implementation in your state or in your district or in your region, or to conduct an evaluation study, and you want to get together and work on that together. All are possible. And what I want to indicate is doing OpenSciEd research does not imply you have to be a partner with OpenSciEd, the organization. These materials are available for you to use in your research. So our vision is an extended community that's investigating how to improve science education broadly, centered on an open, modern, high-quality curriculum. On the next slide, I'm just going to clarify that there's a range of types of research studies we're inviting and welcoming as well. These can range from, at the top, core research about very fundamental things about teaching and learning. How do equity and student questioning connect? At the other end, there's huge interest in questions of scale up. How does OpenSciEd spread? How do teachers achieve depth of implementation? How does it sustain? How does it evolve? And in the middle, we have questions about design, implementation, and efficacy. All are important, all are welcome here. Next slide, please. And so by coming together in a research community, we would have the ability to share insights with each other, even though we're studying different things and in different ways. For example, we may have a large urban district that establishes a partnership, a researcher-practitioner partnership, to adapt the materials. Jim mentioned how they're adaptable, to tackle science equity in their district. And there may be another group that's a consortium of rural developers that's going to develop a toolkit and guidelines for adapting OpenSciEd to rural communities. Well, because they're centering on the same curriculum, there are going to be some things we learn about adapting OpenSciEd that will be common to both. And so by working together, it's going to grow stronger. I'm going to address this a bit more as I follow up on the next slide. So our belief at Digital Promise, working closely with OpenSciEd, is OpenSciEd really opens up powerful, important new research opportunities because it's open, it's free, it's adaptable, etc. We believe that doing important research is not something you do alone. It requires bringing all the types of stakeholders who are already on this call. And it's so wonderful to see the range of voices and people who introduce themselves on the call. Welcome all. It's when we come together that we do really great research. Individual research projects are more rigorous and more relevant when they're part of a community that frames those research questions together. And we believe very strongly that equity is a pressing challenge that we all need to come together around and work together on. No one's going to solve it on their own. So we need to be a community to tackle that. So to close my portion, we're making a call to action to join a working group. These working groups will define what this community should become and what kinds of research questions it should seek to answer and what types of research it should do. So thank you. And now I'm super excited to introduce Oki Lee, who will be our next speaker. She's a professor at NYU. She's a distinguished science educator. And every time I listen to Oki, I learn something powerful about equity. So I'm very excited to hear her remarks today.
Thank you, Jeremy. I wanted to thank Kevin and Dave for preparing the presentation together. So it has been collective work. I would like to push Jim's idea of health and COVID-19 in a broader context of the national agenda right now. When you visit buildbackbetter.gov, it used to be 4 priorities around the COVID-19, racial equity, climate change, and economic recovery. Right now, there are 7 immediate priorities. The next slide. What really intrigues me about these 7 immediate priorities of the current administration is when you look at the left, These are STEM or science subjects. The middle is equity, whether you call it racial equity and linguistic equity. So to me, what is really important about those two sets are that one, at the core of the current administration is science and equity. It just smacks us, that's one. The second is that equity is at the center. It's not, oops, we forgot or we need to accommodate. Because when you think about the disproportionate numbers of people who got infected by COVID-19, it's a racial and equity minorities, it's environmental justice. Health is also equity issue. So in fact, by looking at this, equity is at the center where science serves the equity. And when we address equity, it addresses the national agenda. Next slide. Now, what does it mean for us in terms of OpenSciEd? Now, when you think about all standards, all students, and I know a thing about all standards and all students when I read the NGSS equity, diversity and equity team. Right now, we are in the contemporary, the middle column, and we are very all excited that all students are making sense of a phenomena and designing solutions to problems as the scientists and engineers do. And that started in early 1910. And when we say traditional, we're talking about up to 2010. Now, with all the societal changes, the future is thrust upon us. So we are in the contemporary, but we are in the future. And what does it mean for STEM education, where STEM and equity are at the core of the current administration? So I would like to ask all our community to think about that. The next slide is that we can think of as equity traditionally and contemporary. We thought of it as the same resources as input. Equity, in fact, outcome of same rigorous outcomes. Now, how do we achieve the same rigorous outcomes for all students, including all, meaning everybody? Next slide. One way to approach that the same outcome for all students is the shift from deficit to assets. Now, I'm going to use the vintage point of my own work with a focus on English learners. So English learners, but equity and diversity comes in many different groups. And I'm just saying it's a one way to look at one student group. There is a deficit versus asset. I just wanted to think with the science educators that terms indicate the shifts, and we need to be very cautious and rethink about the terms we use and the underlying assumptions that we use for the terms. You may remember that No Child Left Behind used the term limited English proficient students and left, and nobody liked it because it is limited. And then came the alternative terms like non-English language. We didn't like it either. It's a non-English, culturally, linguistically diverse, and we didn't quite like it either because not only is broad, but diversity is used as a code word for minoritized students. And then came English language learners, and English language learners were taken up by Every Student Succeeds Act of 2015. So we are using English learners. Then came those people who thought of it as a class half empty, did not like English learners. So we thought of emergent bilinguals. We didn't like it because it's always emergent, it's a level 2. Bilingual, well, what about the multilingual? So the current term is multilingual learners. So we have the federal term of English learners, and we have the term that has been emerging in the field, multilingual learners. Now, when you look at the the trajectory of the history, you can imagine what might be like in future federal legislation. I'm hoping and I'm assuming that it will be multilingual learners or something comparable. The reason I'm asking and saying is that the research pushes the field, and it may actually be taking the lead for federal that affects all student populations. So I would like to put the idea of research and then how research guides a policy and practice. Next slide. I would like to use actually now the example. The example with English learners is that we typically thought of English learners as a limited English student, limited. Oki does not have English, and you are already defining me as a deficit of not having English, but you may not know that I have a lot of assets that I can use doing science. So we are not pre-teaching, we are not front-loading. We're not doing vocabulary, we're actually doing science by involving all students, and I'm going to use the doing science around the garbage. Next slide. Jim, you would be happy that it's an NGSS design batch. All right, so I'm going to use the doing science and using language. What is that smell? And it is a beautiful smell coming out of the garbage with a safety precaution and all of that. Next slide. When we ask the students to draw what smell may be like, some students may start from a cloud that is floating toward me, or some students may think of a number 2, lines that are coming toward me. And then after about 2 weeks of a classical experimentation, students learned that air particle and smell particle and particles are moving freely. And those colors are not simply pretty. Those colors actually have a meaning. That red is a smell, blue is air, and arrows mean random. And we have to be really cautious and give a credit to the students who are trying to communicate their ideas. And that goes into smell moves freely toward me and I can smell. So you can see the students that you text, talk, meaning oral and written, but diagrams, symbols, tables, and graphs, and computer computational models and home language, all of those. So students are using multimodality. The next slide. Here is an example of a student in the beginning who thought that the lines indicate the smell of a pizza in the cafeteria, and you can see the labels and descriptions of what it is. The next slide shows that after the instruction, the student developed the model. You can see close the system. Wow, there is a key, and there is a banana and orange in different colors. And when you look at the diagram or the model, you can see that orange smell is in orange color, banana smell is in yellow, and they are particles moving freely in random. Now, science educators may say, my students get it, I will move on, and I say, stop, not so. This is really a wonderful time to say, explain in writing, so the students can provide a complete understanding. And that's where visual, non-linguistic, and writing, explain in writing can complement each other. Now, that's a multimodality. Next slide. Let's think about another way, think of using language to do. Using language. So here we are talking about language registers. And okay, when students smell garbage coming out of the jar, ew, it stinks. And here's a word the teacher can amplify language, amplify. If it stinks, is it something or nothing? Well, students have to say it is something because I can smell it. Now, if it is something, what is it? Is it solid? No. Is it liquid? No. What is it then? It's a gas. For the NGSS, solid and liquid are introduced in 2nd grade, and gas and the notion of particles are introduced in 5th grade. Now, if it is a gas, the application of language continues. Why can't we see gas? So here comes the experiments of what gas is made of and matter is made of. So students learn that gas is made of, but those are tiny, tiny little things that are too small to see. Those are tiny, tiny little things that are too small to see. At some point, the students are going to say, how do you call them? And the teacher says, we call them particles. Are we good? We are good. So students will say, smell is a gas made of particles are too small to see. And it goes into smell is a gas made of particles moving freely in space. That is a DCI of a 5th grade in physical science. So students are moving from everyday specialized register within about 2 weeks. Next slide. Here is an example of a student who actually did write something. Smell travels freely, and the wind helps it get more spread out. You can't see smell because its particles are too small to see. That's pretty much the DCI statement of a 5th grade. Now you say, whoa, the student got the idea, move on. And I say, not so. This is really a good time. Now the students have an understanding. We can work on the linguistic accuracy. Maybe we could reorganize sentences. There is some linguistic spelling error. So this is a really good time to work on language. Now the students have an understanding. What is important? Students have the understanding based on the experience. Now is the time to improve language. The next slide. So we just spoke about all the assets. Again, the main idea is that, yes, I don't speak English. I don't understand English, but do not define me as a deficit of a not speaking. I have a multi-modality of gestures, facial expressions. I can use a Google Translate to translate. I can do diagrams and non-linguistic, and I will get to reading and writing, but give me the opportunities to have ideas first, and then communication. So we have everyday language going to specialize, home language getting into translanguaging. Multimodality includes all modes of communication, of linguistic, non-linguistic gestures, all of those. So these are only just some assets that English learners or multilingual learners bring to education. And it's only one snippet of next slide of a students who bring all those assets. Don't think of them as if they are different and deficit. Think of them as assets to work on. So my plain English is instead of you don't have it, another way to say is show me what you got. We'll work from there. Okay. So I wanted to end by showing the images of the next slide. If we capitalize on assets, how do we promote the contemporary based on the NGSS, moving to the future where complex, pressing societal challenges may be facing the students, and we may move into the future. And I will end with the last slide of what does it mean where equity is at the center, where science serves the equity. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Oki. My name is Anthony Baker, and I'm on the Learning Experience Design team at Digital Promise. I think we heard Jeremy say that we really want to build a research agenda that brings together everybody in our community that has a stake in this work. And to that end, we've been really intentional about trying to include and elevate the voice of practitioners. So we were lucky enough to connect with a practitioner in Michigan, Cheryl Zarnick, and we've got a video of her sharing her experience working with OpenSciEd in her classroom and what her students had to say about it, and some of the challenges and opportunities that she sees in this work.
I'm Cheryl Zarnick. I've been teaching science for 30 years. I teach at Davis Junior High, which is part of Utica Community Schools. And we're actually located in Sterling Heights, Michigan, which is about 30 miles from Detroit. And I'm very excited about OpenSciEd. One of my goals is to allow my students to become deeper thinkers, and I want them to question everything around them. I've been able to create a scientific community with my students. They feel very comfortable in answering each other's questions, especially sharing their thoughts. We've even come to an understanding that it's okay to disagree with each other. Another success I've seen is with my students where they realize that they've gotten, especially my 8th graders who've been through this 2 years in a row, they know that when they give an answer, they're used to supporting it with the evidence that we've collected so far. Like right now, we're doing the penguin unit. And so a lot of them have been using the evidence of they all look the same, they have the same traits. So they're noticing that they're doing that quite a bit. I've even asked my students how they felt about it. And the one student quoted that he really likes it because it makes him think more about the topic. He said, I love answering all the questions. And he also said he thought that all the examples and the experiments we do are very cool. The first challenge is currently our district has not adopted a curriculum. So we're only doing the 7th and 8th grade units. So we're noticing that they don't have the background of some of the content. So I'm not sure if you could help me with that, or if you have any suggestions on how we might be able to solve some of those issues, because I know we don't have time to do the 6th grade units in 7th and 8th grade. Another challenge is when students are absent, they're missing that science community and that deep understanding and that deep discussion. So what suggestions you have that we can do to help support those students that are missing what's being done in the classroom? And then a third challenge is with my English learners and my special ed students. They're not always making the connections. So I'm wondering if there's anything else I can do that will help support them to make those connections. So I'm very excited to see what research you come together and bring for me to have my students use so that they can have a deeper understanding of these awesome topics that we've been covering with OpenSciEd. Thank you so much.
Thanks again to Cheryl for sharing her voice and her experiences with OpenSciEd. Really excited to see what the practitioners that are in our working groups now bring to the table so that we can work and make sure that we can put this research to work on the ground. Now I'd like to introduce Danny Edelson, who is the Executive Director of BSCS Science Learning, and they're the lead institution in the OpenSciEd Developers Consortium, and they're responsible for the overall coordination and development of field testing. Welcome, Danny.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I'd like to start by thanking Kevin McElhaney and Jeremy Rochelle for inviting me to speak today. And of course, I want to thank Jim Short at Carnegie Corporation for funding the project that brought us all here today with the goal of developing a research agenda for OpenSciEd, something that I think is critically important. I also want to express my gratitude to the scores of unit leads, writers, and other professionals that have brought amazing creativity, understanding, and commitment to developing this curriculum. And I want to thank the state leaders and hundreds of field test and co-design teachers that have made our program the outstanding product that it is. In the few minutes that I have with you today, I'm going to talk about my ideas for how to approach the development of a research agenda for the OpenSciEd middle school program. I'll be presenting these ideas as a matter of perspective, and I'll be describing a variety of perspectives on OpenSciEd. To be explicit about the perspective that I bring to this, I've had the great good fortune to be the leader of the multi-institution, multidisciplinary consortium that has developed, tested, and revised the OpenSciEd middle school program. In that role, I haven't been directly responsible for even one page of the actual program, but I have been responsible for selecting, guiding, and coordinating those that are, along with my co-directors, Brian Reiser, Kate McNeil, Bill Penwell, and Shelley Ledoux. Even more important than my formal role for understanding my perspective on this work is the fact that I believe deeply in the potential of the OpenSciEd middle school program to transform science education, and I intend to be its advocate for years to come. The first perspective I have to propose is that OpenSciEd is an innovation. That perspective reflects the fact that there is an entire literature on innovations and why they experience broad uptake or lack of use, why some stay in use for a long time and others fade away, why some stay true to the designer's vision, and why others get altered until they are unrecognizable. Thinking about OpenSciEd as an innovation leads to questions like, what does it take to get people to adopt it? What enables people who do adopt it to experience what they consider to be success with it? If it does make it to a reasonable level of initial adoption, then what happens? Do people continue to use it over time? Do they use it in ways that resemble the designer's intent? Does the way they use it change over time? If so, does it change for the better or for worse? Next slide. The second perspective is that OpenSciEd is a solution to a challenge. This perspective leads to evaluation. If OpenSciEd is supposed to be a solution, then we can evaluate if and how it actually solves the challenge. This is a very important perspective, not just to the state science leads and funders who are behind this work, but also to all the educators that are going to consider using it in the future. When you take this perspective, you naturally ask questions like, what exactly is the challenge being addressed? And how do we know if we're making progress on solving it? Does OpenSciEd show evidence that it is making progress? Is it any better than alternatives? Under what conditions and for whom does it show evidence of success? And does its effectiveness justify its cost? Next slide. My third perspective is the design research perspective. That's the perspective that recognizes that OpenSciEd's design has been driven by a combination of evidence and theory, that it is, in essence, the embodiment of a theory of change, or at least a collection of conjectures, and that it provides us with a way of testing the assumptions behind the conjectures and the conjectures themselves. The questions that follow from this perspective are things like, are the assumptions that were made in the design valid in the real world with all of its complexity and variety? Do the conjectures embodied in the design bear out individually and collectively? Next slide. The fourth perspective is a very different one. In this perspective, I take the position that OpenSciEd can be viewed as a reference standard and used by researchers to build on research by others and compare their findings to a known standard. The idea here is that one of the reasons we do not achieve cumulativity in educational research is that we do not have standard interventions that we can use the way that biology uses what they call model organisms, hence the Drosophila for educational research. The concept of a reference standard is not limited to biology, though. It is widespread across science and engineering fields. I propose that OpenSciEd can provide reference standard for science education, research, and evaluation that suits the needs of our community. For example, with OpenSciEd as a reference standard, researchers would not need to compare new interventions to business as usual, which has no known qualities other than those measured in the study. Instead, they could compare it to a version of OpenSciEd, whose characteristics would be well documented by prior research. Even more appealing to me is the idea that OpenSciEd can provide a new baseline for designing interventions. For example, if I were to have ideas about an approach to scaffolding argumentation, I wouldn't need to write a whole new unit from scratch to test them the way most of us do currently. Instead, I could just modify one or more existing OpenSciEd units and compare the outcomes with unmodified units. This has two advantages. First, it would require far less effort to develop an intervention, which would dramatically lower the barrier for individuals and for less well-resourced research teams. Second, it would provide them with a base case with well-understood properties to compare to in their studies. So the questions that follow from this perspective fall into two categories. First, how do we establish a baseline understanding of OpenSciEd so that it fulfills this vision of a well-understood and well-documented reference standard? Second, if we have OpenSciEd as a well-understood reference standard, what questions should we use it to ask? Next slide. So those are the four perspectives that I have to share with you today. I hope they will be helpful to your work. In closing, I just want to share a few additional ideas about the OpenSciEd middle school program that I think will be helpful for you to have in mind. First, OpenSciEd belongs to the world. We developed it, states supervised our work, foundations funded it, the OpenSciEd organization is responsible for disseminating it, but none of us own it. That is important because it means anyone can use it or modify it. Second, what we have now is a first version. It is intended to grow and have offspring. No one should ever approach it or any of the versions to come as a finished product. Third, I think that OpenSciEd is the best education program for middle school ever written. But the reality is we've only scratched the surface of what's possible for supporting equity, engagement, learning, and development. I hope that everyone will see it as a challenge to do even better. And I hope that they will use it as a stepping stone for doing better, either by improving it or by rejecting it and showing how powerful an alternative to it can be. Finally, OpenSciEd is vulnerable. There's a high risk of failure if any of three things happen. If it doesn't get out there enough for us to even understand its potential, if people hold it to too high of a standard and dismiss it for what it isn't yet, and three, if the current version is all that ever gets produced. So one important thing that you can do with your research agenda is to help OpenSciEd achieve its potential as an open license curriculum program and to ward off these three possibilities of failure. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Danny. Hi, everyone. I'm Kevin McElhaney, Senior Research Scientist at Digital Promise. And I'd like to introduce the preliminary logic model we've developed that we hope will be a useful tool for us as we articulate the research agenda together. I don't want to assume everyone here has experience with logic models, so I want to illustrate what it's for and how we hope it can help. Next slide, please. Before I give you the tour of the logic model, I first want to make a few points about it. First of all, it's just an initial attempt based on our conversations with OpenSciEd leads and some reports and manuscripts. We've developed it in this white paper draft that's posted to our webpage and linked in the chat, I believe. We see this as something to get your input on so we can continue to improve it together. Second, we did not intend to include everything in the model. We're just focusing on what's distinctive about OpenSciEd. And third, it's very high level. So that means we try to capture the whole OpenSciEd ecosystem, but it doesn't go too much into the weeds. So people doing research will want to elaborate certain parts of it for their specific needs. So with that, let's take a look at it. Next slide. Here's the zoomed out view of the model. Basically, a logic model describes the rationale for expecting outcomes from an intervention. So it can shape research by explicitly linking things like principles, features, and implementation, and describing how these things lead to the desired research outcomes, like for students and teachers. It's going to take a whole community, us, to move forward this research agenda. So mapping this all out can help coordinate different research efforts, and it can also help keep track of what's being supported by research evidence and where we still need to collect more evidence. So on the left there, in the purple boxes, these are the distinctive principles guiding OpenSciEd design, which I realize now we should have just called secret sauce, as Jim Short called it earlier. These are things like investigations being coherent from the student's perspective, or that students work together to build and refine their ideas. We've also listed what we call unique affordances in the lower left, things like OpenSciEd being freely available, or that it's open to being adapted. In the middle section in the blue, there's these three nested layers where OpenSciEd's designed to work. In this inner layer, that's the dark area, it describes what OpenSciEd looks like in a classroom. The layer surrounding that is how teachers need to be supported in order to learn OpenSciEd and use it successfully in the classroom. And the outside layer describes the system structures that make it possible, in turn, for teachers to benefit from that support and for districts to adopt OpenSciEd sustainably. On the right side in the green, there are a range of outcomes that OpenSciEd aims to promote. I'll dive into these in a second. That double arrow connecting the ecosystem and the outcomes indicates that certain outcomes can in turn become part of the OpenSciEd ecosystem, for example, customized materials or technology innovations. So I'm just going to zoom briefly on a few parts of this model. I'm not going to go into too much detail because it's all in the paper, as I mentioned, that we posted. Next slide, please. So at the classroom level, the design of OpenSciEd reflects the distinctive principles by promoting certain kinds of interactions among students, teachers, and the materials, like how investigations are driven by students' own scientific questions, or the emphasis on student consensus building. Also, each of the classroom, teacher supports, and system levels lists some examples of research opportunities that are aligned with that level. So for instance, at the classroom level, research might involve designing supporting technologies or studying teachers' instructional practices. Next slide, please. This one zooms into the teacher supports layer. OpenSciEd teacher materials and PD experiences need to help teachers implement the instructional approach successfully and support teacher growth. Supports emphasize a set of themes, and the PD workshops engage teachers in activities that focus on the student perspective, valuing students' voices, and especially on the unique kinds of decisions that teachers need to make when teaching OpenSciEd. Next slide, please. The system refers to structures at the school and district and state level that can support high quality implementation and teacher growth. Districts will struggle to be successful if teachers don't have the time and space to learn, or if they don't sufficiently incentivize the instructional model, which is really ambitious. So at the system level, OpenSciEd involves things like collaborations with state officers, network of certified PD providers, and giving direct support to districts. Next slide. We've divided the outcomes into these 4 broad categories, which are student outcomes, teacher capacity, system outcomes, and what we're calling resources and innovations. Again, this is not an exhaustive list, but for instance, student outcomes include NGSS-based learning, but also include other things like their science engagement and autonomy, and that these outcomes are equitable both within and across classrooms. Down there in the lower right, the resources and innovations category includes things that will be produced from OpenSciEd, like customized materials or new technologies. Next slide. I'm going to close with a quick example of how the logical model can support investigators in defining a research study. So say you want to study ways that districts make OpenSciEd their own when they adopt it. You might look at how districts adapt the PD materials to meet their constraints. Do they use a coaching model? Do they shift their policies and practices? Things like that. These questions would link parts of the model in particular ways, like how the system and teacher supports interact, or whether the adaptations were indeed faithful to the distinctive principles that are on the left. As an investigator, you can unpack these parts of the model into your own more detailed model to guide your research. And that's it for the logical model. So I'm going to hand things over to my colleague, Babe Lieberman, to bring things to a close. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much, Kevin, and the rest of the speakers for kicking off this initiative. So over the next few months, we'll be engaging working groups of practitioners, researchers, developers, and funders, including many of you on this call, to collaborate on this research agenda. And so we'll be generating research questions, pitching briefs, and considering equitable methodologies, and even forming some new partnerships for research. So if you're not already connected and you'd like to be, please email us with any ideas, questions, or to get involved. And we really hope you will stay involved to follow our progress on this and to share your input. And of course, stay connected to us on social media and be sure to download the resources that we included in the chat here. Next slide. I know folks have to go, so I just want to briefly recognize the team within Digital Promise that has been working on this project to bring you folks together for this initial webinar and also to continue the work on the research agenda moving forward. Next slide. Finally, our program committee, we're so honored to be working with our program committee members who bring their expertise in science education, curricular materials, research, and equity, and are helping us to shape our process. So more information about them as well on our website. And finally, thanks to all of you for joining this community. We're really excited to build an equity-centered OpenSciEd research agenda together. So have a great day, and please be in touch with us if you have any questions, and you will receive more information about working groups very shortly.